everyone, Mr. Eford here. I hope that you guys are doing well. We're coming at you today with another video lesson about ancient Israel. And today we are going to be moving past what we looked at last time when we looked at the origins of Israel, the story of Abraham and his family, the Exodus with Moses leading the people out of Egypt and into the Promised Land, and the time period of the Judges, where we see Israel retaking the land that had once belonged to them and had become occupied during their time living in Egypt. And so today we're going to move into a really interesting point in Israel's history, and that is the story of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. We're going to talk about how Israel chose their first king. We're going to talk about some of the famous kings like David and Solomon and what some of their contributions were. And then as we get toward the end of the lesson, we're going to look at how Israel fell apart. We're going to look at how Israel was conquered by the Assyrians and the Chaldeans, and where that leaves them kind of moving into the future. So we're going to cover the time period of the kings today. My students at home, you guys know the drill. You have a note sheet that's attached to this video and to the slideshow, which I will also link with you. Please make sure that you are filling in the notes and that you save that at the end of the lesson so that you can go back and review this later on. We have a lot to cover today, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And we're going to start with a very simplistic statement. This is going to take us where we're going today. The Israelites chose a king. All right, that's where everything starts. They choose a king. And the reason they choose a king is because they wanted protection from their enemies. And we're going to see where in some cases the king was kind of a good thing. In some cases, the leadership of Israel being a king was not such a good thing. And we'll get into why that was as we move into our notes today. So let's get started. All right, first off, we have to back up to around 1000 BC. And we look at Israel, and the strongest people living there are not the Israelites, right? They're a relatively small group of people, 12 tribes of shepherds. They're not really warriors. The strongest people in the land are actually the people of Philistia. We call them the Philistines, right? The Philistines had strong cities with walls. They knew how to make iron tools and weapons. And we know from looking at Assyria that the ability to make iron tools and weapons is important. It gives you an advantage over all of your rivals, especially if they're fighting with bronze or copper or some other kind of metal. Iron is stronger. And so we see the Philistines know how to make tools and weapons out of iron. So according to the Hebrew Bible, some of the Israelites began to copy the Philistine religion. They began to worship Philistine gods, practice their culture and beliefs. And that was, of course, against the laws of the Israelites, right? The 10 Commandments said that God spoke and said that you can only believe in the one true God. You can't trust these other false gods. And so the people of Israel were moving away from that. And as a result of that, Israelites began to think that they needed a king to unify and protect them, to solve this problem of branching off into idol worship or believing something different from a rival culture. So they believed that a king would unify the 12 tribes and help them fight off their enemies like the Philistines. All right, so this leads to, and around the year 1020, the Israelites began to demand. They said, we want a king. And they went to a guy named Samuel to make this request. Samuel is the last judge. And Samuel is driven by the people. They come to him, Samuel, we need a king, we need a king, we need a king. Samuel was a judge and a prophet, meaning that the Israelites saw him as a person who had a direct connection with God. That when God spoke to Samuel, he could interpret it. He knew exactly what God was telling them to do. And so they thought, this is the right guy to pick our king for us. Samuel, though, warned the people. He said, I'm not so sure that you really want what you think you want. He says, when you get a king, you get other things too, like taxes. The Israelites haven't had to pay taxes before. He says, a king's going to tax you. He's going to take your money that you work really, really hard to earn. A king is also going to make you a slave to his will. And so Samuel says, when the king makes laws, you've got to do what the king says. You're not bound to that yet. Are you sure you really want this? And the people came back and said, yes, we want a king. Samuel, choose us a king. And so Samuel chose a young man named Saul. Okay. Saul was a warrior and a farmer. He looked the part. He was tall. He was handsome. He was good in battle. And so Samuel chooses Saul and anoints him as king. You're going to see an image of this on the next slide where Samuel anoints Saul and makes him the king of Israel. Samuel did eventually anoint Saul as king. In other words, he blessed him with oil. We're going to see that in the picture on the next slide to show that God had chosen him. Saul was tall and handsome. He looked the part. He'd won many battles. And for a long time, Saul was actually a pretty good king for the Israelites. And then some bad things happened. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. So in the image, you see Samuel, the older man here, the prophet, is holding a cup over the young man who's bowed down his head. And he's going to pour that oil over the head of Saul to show that God had chosen him. It was a symbolic way of saying, God has made you the king. Okay. And for a time, this was a good thing. But if you look at the second line in the text here, it says the Hebrew Bible says that Saul lost favor with God. He chose to do some things that were not what God wanted him to do. And so he ended up losing the blessing of God. And God chose another king instead of Saul to replace him. We'll get into that in just a moment. All right, so Saul defeated the Israelites' enemies one by one, battle after battle. However, according to the Hebrew Bible, he did some things that were displeasing to God. He disobeyed some of God's commands. And God chose another king to replace Saul. Okay. Now, this other king was chosen in secret. Saul didn't really know about it. But eventually, when Saul fell, this new person was going to become the king. And Samuel went and appointed this new king. He actually went to a man named Jesse. Remember that Samuel is a prophet. He hears from God to go to the family of Jesse, and that one of Jesse's sons will be the new king. So Samuel shows up at Jesse's house, and he looks over all of the young men who were there, who were Jesse's sons. And Jesse's got a lot of sons, so they're all lined up.
Miss Palmer, please
we'll listen to see what the announcement is. Sorry about that, guys. So Jesse is looking at all or Saul is looking at all of, my apologies. Samuel is looking at all of Jesse's children. I'll get it right here in just a minute. Samuel's looking at all of Jesse's children here, and he looks from the oldest to the youngest, and he says, I don't get it. God told me that one of your kids was going to be the king, but I don't see him here. I don't see the chosen one. And he asked Jesse the question. He says, don't you have any other sons? I'm not seeing the one that God's chosen here. And Jesse says, yeah, I got one other son, but he's off in the field tending sheep. He's the youngest one. And I really didn't think that, that he would be the chosen one. So I didn't even call him in to meet you. And Samuel says, well, call him in. I want to meet this young man. And so Jesse calls for his youngest son, David, to come. David, we believe, is about maybe 12 years old at this point in time. And he shows up, and Samuel immediately knows that, hey, this is the guy. This is the guy that God's chosen to be the new king. And so Samuel anoints David as king of Israel. As a young boy, Saul is still the king. Saul is going to continue to be the king for many more years. But when Saul falls, eventually, David is going to replace him and become the new king. Okay, so according to, again, this is the second bullet point here, David had to be called back in from the field where he was tending sheep when Samuel arrived, so that Samuel could anoint him to be the new king of Israel. Okay. Now remember, Saul is still the king at this point, but eventually he will fall in battle along with his three sons, and David will become the new king at that point in time. All right, so King David builds the empire of Israel. He makes Jerusalem the capital city. Those are some of his major accomplishments. And of course, the story that we know about David is the one that we're going to talk about here at this point in time. Even before he became the king of Israel, David was known for his bravery and his leadership. The Hebrew Bible describes how he became famous by telling the story of David and Goliath. Before a battle against the Philistines, we know that the Israelites and the Philistines were constantly fighting over the control of the land. That a great Philistine giant named Goliath dared the Israelites to fight him one-on-one. Okay, and this was an interesting choice here. Goliath comes out during a time where you would have been talking about a truce. A soldier from each side would come out, and they would negotiate ways that maybe we could end this without a fight. So Goliath comes out, and he's waiting for an Israelite challenger to come and meet him. According to the story, Goliath is almost 10 foot tall. He's huge. He's a mountain of a man. And so he comes out and he yells out at the Israelites. He says, send out your best soldier to fight me one-on-one. He said, we can avoid all this bloodshed, all this battle that's about to happen. If we fight one-on-one and your soldier beats me, we'll become your slaves. Our land will become your land. You win. But if I defeat him, you lose. And we take back everything that belongs to us. We take your land. You become our captives. You become our slaves. And the Israelites were so scared. They went hid in their tents. Goliath was huge. Nobody wanted to face him one-on-one. But David, when he heard the challenge of Goliath, immediately went to the king and he said, let me fight him. David's a kid. He's a teenager. He's not even allowed to be in the army. He's not a warrior yet. He's still a shepherd. He had only come to the battlefield to bring food to his older brothers who were soldiers. And so David shows up. He tells Saul, look, I got this. I can take this guy. I believe that I'm able to overcome him. And Saul eventually relents and he says, okay, David, if you think you know what you're doing, fine. And he tries to give David his armor. And David says, I can't wear that. It's too big. It's too heavy. You can't even wear the king's armor. So he goes down to the creek bed and he picks up 5 smooth stones and he puts them in his pouch, takes his shepherd's staff, and he walks out to meet the giant. Goliath challenges David. David responds and he says, today you're going to be my victim. I'm going to feed you to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And with that, the two men run at each other, Goliath running in to kill David. David puts a stone in his sling. And we're talking about a slingshot that not like a slingshot like we think of where you pull back and you shoot. This slingshot was a piece of leather with a pocket in it that you would swing over your head. And then when you got a momentum, you let go of one end of that leather strap and the stone would come flying out. And David threw that stone and hit Goliath square between the eyes and knocked the giant dead. And so David single-handedly won a battle against the Philistines. And that immediately made him a famous guy in Israel. Everyone knew who David was. Saul honored him as a great leader and commander. And this story, of course, makes David famous. And it's one that a lot of people are familiar with. And a lot of people know the story of David and Goliath. So this is the first time David's really kind of on the stage in Israel. People know his name. They know who he is. And so that kind of at least puts him in the forefront of people's minds at this point in time. All right, Goliath roared, rushed forward. Again, we're telling the story here with a heavy spear. David hurled one single stone straight at the giant's forehead. Goliath dropped dead on the spot. Here's where the story continues. After Goliath falls, Saul put David in charge of his army. And that makes sense because David has led a successful military campaign at this point against the Philistine. As his victories grew, because Goliath was not his only victory, he won battle after battle. The Israelites, and especially the women, began to sing his praise when he would come into the city. And they said this, and it actually made Saul a little bit upset. They said, Saul has slain, that means killed. Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands. In other words, Saul's a great guy, but David's even better. And that made Saul mad. Like, he didn't like that at all. He wanted to be at the forefront. After all, he's the king. Who's this David kid anyway? And so Saul becomes jealous of David. And there's a rivalry that grows between them. And you see at the bottom of that bullet point there, Saul even plans to kill David. He wants to get this guy out of the way because he's jealous of him. So David had to hide out in enemy territory. And he waited until Saul and all 3 of his sons died in battle, which was hard for David because David was actually best friends with Saul's oldest son, whose name was Jonathan. But Saul and Jonathan, his other 2 sons, died in battle. And so the line of the king of Israel had fallen at that point in time. And because Samuel had chosen David, David steps in as king. The bitter rivalry between Saul and David was now over, and David was able to take his throne in about 1000 BC. That's when we think David became the king of Israel. All right, so King David, let's talk about his accomplishments. He first was in charge of Saul's army. He was known for his bravery and leadership. He's, of course, known for the battle of David and Goliath. In around 1000 BC, David becomes the king of Israel. As king, David defeated the Philistines and drove them out of the region. He created an empire for Israel. They grew and expanded. And then he made their enemies pay tribute to him. So as he conquered more and more people, Israel grew wealthy off of the tribute that was being paid to them by the conquered people who are now part of their empire. And we talked about tribute a little bit earlier on. It basically meant a tax that had to be paid by a conquered people. And so David is forcing these other rival empires to pay money to him. And that makes Israel very wealthy. All right, once in power, according to the Hebrew Bible, David drove the Philistines from the area. He conquered other neighboring nations and created an empire, which is what we just talked about. An empire is one nation that rules over several other nations. The conquered people have to pay David tribute, and the tribute is money or slaves that are given to the stronger ruler. And so again, making Israel wealthy. David made the Israelites pay heavy taxes. He needed that money to expand Israel's capital, Jerusalem. He also wanted to build a temple where the people could come and worship. Their religious objects could be kept there and preserved and cherished by the Israelites. And they would finally have a permanent place of worship. But David died before he could build his temple. And in fact, Samuel came to David and said, God said that you're not allowed to build the temple. David wanted to. That was one of his big things. He wanted to build a temple. And Samuel said, David, you're a warrior. Your hands are bloody from battle. You can't use the hands of a warrior to build a holy place for God. So he told David, you're not going to be allowed to build the temple. That's going to be something your sons have to do. So David, that was one thing David did not accomplish, was building a temple. He wanted to, but he, of course, could not do that. He died before the temple was constructed. But the Israelites remember him as their greatest king, the strongest leader, a guy who took them in the right direction. And, of course, he's revered even today as one of the greatest kings of ancient Israel. All right, that moves us into David's son, whose name was Solomon. When David died, his son Solomon became the king. It was Solomon who built the temple. It was a splendid temple made out of stone. It became the symbol and the center of Jewish religion. In the Hebrew Bible, Solomon was known for his wise sayings. The story goes that Solomon was basically able to have this conversation with God, where God said, Solomon, you can ask anything of me, and I will give it to you, whatever you want. And typically people would ask for things like, give me money, give me immortality, give me just things that you would think would make you happy. And Solomon's request was different. Solomon said, I want to be wise. I want to know the right thing to do and the right thing to say. And so God blessed Solomon with wisdom. Again, this is according to the Hebrew Bible. God blessed Solomon with wisdom and made him the wisest man on earth. But he also became rich and famous as well. So wisdom, wealth, and fame all went with Solomon wherever he went. His wise sayings are called Proverbs. There's an entire book of the Old Testament called the Book of Proverbs, which are wise sayings from King Solomon. But many Israelites didn't really like Solomon that much. They hated his rule. And that's because Solomon taxed the people very heavily to pay for the temple in particular and other building projects throughout the kingdom of Israel. The majority of the inside of the temple was decorated either in leaf gold, which meant gold that was encased around wood, or just in items that were made out of solid gold. The temple was lavishly decorated, and that required a lot of money. So the people kind of didn't like Solomon for the fact that he was an expensive king. He taxed them pretty heavily. So the Israelites in the north were especially unhappy with Solomon. To get more money, Solomon had made more of their young men work in his mines in neighboring countries. So even there, people had to do things they didn't really want to do. So Solomon made himself a little bit unpopular that way. All right, when Solomon died, the northern tribes of Israel began to fight amongst themselves and with the southern tribes. Fighting broke out. 10 of the 12 tribes set up their own kingdom in the north. They called it Israel, okay? The other 2 tribes remained in the south, and they called themselves the kingdom of Judah. And this is where the capital of Jerusalem is located, in the south, in the king of Judah, or in the land of Judah. All right, so a troubled time. You see here what's going to happen. The Israelites were conquered and forced to leave Israel and Judah. While the Israelites were dividing their kingdom up, the Assyrians and the Chaldeans were building strong empires to the southwest. This is in what is now Mesopotamia, okay, in Southwest Asia. These people wanted to control trade routes, and Israel, unfortunately, is in the very center of the trade routes between Egypt, the Mediterranean Sea, the land of Mesopotamia. You have to go through Israel to get to those points. And so Israel is an important location. The Chaldeans and the Assyrians want control of that because it would give them a lot of money and a lot of resources, okay? So they want to control the trade routes that run through the Israelite kingdoms. Small and weak, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah felt threatened by their powerful neighbors. There was no way they could fight against the Assyrians. They were too small. They didn't have enough soldiers. Remember, most of the Israelites are shepherds. They're not really trained to fight. So this is kind of a dangerous time for them as their neighbors began to ramp up for war and to prepare for battle so that they can conquer and take over these trade routes. All right, so that leads us into the prophets. During this terrible time when Israel is concerned about invasion and about being taken over by these rival kingdoms, people who became known as prophets brought hope to the kingdom of Israel. The prophets emphasized religious ideals, leading a moral life, helping others to connect with God. Their special message was about being faithful, and it meant more than just going to the temple to worship. It meant living a life and working for justice for your society. The prophet Amos once said that justice should roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. In other words, that's the ideal to work for. You should work toward justice. Okay. The Jewish goal of a just society also became an important part of both Christianity and Islam. Those practices continue on through both of those faiths. All right, the warlike Assyrians eventually do conquer Israel. They were feared everywhere in the region. Remember, they used iron tools. They were vicious. They were relentless. When they conquered a nation, the Assyrians would destroy all of the main buildings, and they scattered the populace. The people who lived there had to go into other places. The Assyrians would then settle in the land and take over the territory. In the year 722, the Assyrians conquered Israel and scattered the 10 tribes across the empire. Over time, the Israelites who were forced to move lost contact with all of the people who were back in Israel and Judah. Historians don't really know what happened to them. We refer to them as the 10 lost tribes. Again, they were scattered, and many of them never really returned back to Israel. We believe that they probably just sort of, their culture diffused into the lands that they moved into, that they began to identify with those other cultures, and that they eventually kind of became part of that society. And they lost that identity as being, I'm an Israelite, I'm a Jew, I'm a person who follows these Judaic beliefs. Okay? The Assyrians brought people from other places and had them settle in Samaria, which is the capital of Israel. The settlers mixed with the surviving Israelites who had not been killed or forced to move, and a new culture began to emerge here. The people became known as the Samaritans, and there's a bitter relationship between the people of Judah and the Samaritans, because again, that was a mixture of people from Assyria, people from other places, and the Israelites who had remained there. They continue to have some of the same beliefs and practices, following the Torah, worshiping only one God. But those relationships between the people of Judah and Samaria were bitter. They were not good relationships. Okay? The Samaritans adopted many Israelite beliefs. They worshiped only one God, the God of Israel. They read the Torah. They followed the Israelites' religious laws. But over time, their religious practices developed separately. They had little contact. Today's Judaism developed from the religious practices of the tribes of Judah, and not those of the people of Samaria. So two different sort of religious beliefs, although they had the same root, the same sort of belief system to build their foundation on, they developed differently and separately over time. All right, so eventually Judah falls as well, and that's where we're getting to now. Now only the kingdom of Judah was left of the once proud empire that David had built. It didn't last long. Remember, the 10 tribes have already fallen. Because the Egyptians conquered Judah around 620 BC. The Jews were able to keep their king, but they had to pay tribute to Egypt. So they kind of are able to keep their culture, but they're technically part of Egypt at this point. They have to pay tribute to the Pharaoh. However, the Egyptian rule was cut short when the Chaldeans conquered Egypt in 605 BC. The Chaldeans became the new rulers of Judah, and at first things kind of continued the same one. The Chaldeans allowed the Jews to continue to act the way they once act. They had their culture, they had their language, they were able to keep their king, but they had to pay tribute to the Chaldeans. But several years later, the Jews united with the Egyptians to rebel against the Chaldean rule. Judah held up against the Chaldean invasion until 597 BC. And that's when the guy who we've already talked about when we talked about Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar of the Chaldeans, captured Jerusalem. And he was brutal. He came in, he punished the Jews severely for rejecting his reign. He made 10,000 Jews leave the capital of Jerusalem to go live in Babylon, the Chaldean capital. Then he appointed a new Jewish king. And he said, I'm going to let the ones of you who remain stay here. You're still going to have to pay tribute to me, but you've got to follow my laws. You got to do what I tell you to do. It wasn't long after that that Judah was planning another uprising. They wanted to overthrow Chaldean rule. Bad idea, though. The prophet Jeremiah warned the king that this would end in tragedy. He says, this is a dangerous thing to do. The Chaldeans beat us once. It's not going to be hard for them to beat us again. But the king didn't listen. 586 BC, Israel revolted again against the Chaldeans. This time, the Chaldean ruler Nebuchadnezzar absolutely crushed Jerusalem. He destroyed the temple. He destroyed their walls. He captured the king. And he took him and thousands of other Jews to Babylon. In Jewish history, this time period is known as the time of Babylonian captivity. And there are several stories of prophets that come out of the Babylonian captivity, the main one being the story of Daniel. We're going to look at him a little bit later in the notes that we'll look at probably tomorrow, okay? All right, so in summary, this is where we see the fall of Israel, the fall of Judah, the land of Israel, the 12 tribes. They're not there anymore. The land has been conquered by the Assyrians and the Chaldeans. We see here what took place. Saul was the first king of the Israelites. He united the 12 tribes as one. He built the kingdom up, but eventually fell from grace, right? He made some bad decisions. Then King David built an Israelite empire. He made Jerusalem the capital, and his son Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem. But after he died, the Israelites split into two kingdoms. The kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. I got to remember, we're still in school, so we got announcements going on. And then the Assyrians and the Chaldeans eventually conquered Israel and Judah and forced many Israelites out of their homeland. In the case of the Assyrians, they scattered them into the empire. In the case of the Chaldeans, they took those Israelites to Babylon with them. And then eventually those Israelites were allowed to return home when the Persians conquered the Chaldeans. We'll see Darius the Great, who was one of the kings of Persia, release the Jews to go back to Israel. To rebuild their temple and to continue to worship the way that they had once worshiped. And we'll work our way into that at a later time. That's it for today, guys. I think the next slide just says the end, or that's it. I hope that you've learned something through today's lesson. Remember, the notes are linked. You need to make sure that you go in and fill in the blanks. The slideshow that we went over today is linked as well, so you need to make sure you go back and look at that and answer all those questions by going back through the information there. Hope that you guys have learned something, and we will see you soon. Until then, take care.